And sincere apologies that I'm not able to join you in person this afternoon. Now, I'm going to talk about institutional stigma in people with learning disabilities, the case of Section 11D. And I'm speaking as a psychologist, first and foremost, in seeking to draw connections between Section 11D and the experiences of people with Down syndrome. So it's not just about the very complex balance between the rights and interests of women and the interests of the fetus, but also the balance with the rights and interests of people with Down syndrome that I'm going to be talking about. In my talk, I'll outline how I arrived at my view that Section 11D could be seen as an instance of institutional stigma, and how such institutional stigma has a powerful role to play in either countering or promoting and maintaining stigma. And because most of the research is not specific to people with Down syndrome, I will very much focus on societal values and messages conveyed to people with learning disabilities more generally. Now, we heard a lot this morning about the huge importance about declaring our own position and any conflicts of interest. I should say that I provided an expert witness statement pro bono to support Heidi's and Moya's case in the High Court. I'll do away with any suspense. The High Court judges accepted the government's submission that the law does not perpetuate and reinforce negative cultural stereotypes to the detriment of people with disabilities. And so this was one of the arguments for rejecting the case Heidi and Moya brought. A quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. Talk of stigma is just about everywhere nowadays, but I think it's quite often a fairly poorly understood concept. So I'll quickly tell you what I mean by this term. I'll then talk about the impact of stigma on people with Down syndrome and learning disabilities more generally, make the case that Section 11D could be seen as a case of institutional stigma, and finally I'll outline why I decided to support this case. Now, even though I'm not able to be there with you in person, I'm very mindful how incredibly exciting and wonderful it is to be able to get together in person at last. And I'm also mindful that I'm already running into your break. So I'm going to try and wrap up my talk as quickly as possible. So kicking off with what do we mean by stigma? Originally, the term is credited to the ancient Greeks who use stigma as a way of putting a mark, a dot or puncture, so actually physically branding the bodies of people they wanted to publicly demarcate in some way as undesirable or deviant. The term was then very much picked up in sociology by Irving Goffman in the 60s, and Goffman described stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting and that reduces the bearer from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. And it's the process by which the reaction of others spoils normal identity. And I think it's very fair to say that disability could be very much viewed as a discredited identity, and learning disability as one subcategory. And what Goffman described and what others have since very much drawn out, how the stigmatized person's identity, their very, very idea of themselves and their place in society, gets tainted, and stigma often gets under the person's skin. And I think already some of the stories you've heard from Heidi today, I think have articulated that well. Now, in the field of psychology, two particularly influential thinkers, Bruce Link and Joe Phelan from the States, described stigmatization as a process whereby, first of all, individual attributes are labeled. So this is very much the case for people with learning disabilities or Down syndrome. These attributes are evaluated negatively, and the people who are given those negative labels experience status loss and discrimination, all of which are conditions that are met in the case of people with learning disabilities and people with Down syndrome. How does stigma play out, and how does it materialize in relation to people with learning disabilities and affect their lives? Just very briefly, there's a lot of research, and I think we see this all in our everyday lives, that for a very, very long time, people who learn disabilities have been stereotyped as dependent and childlike, and these are some of the, perhaps, dare I call it, more positive stereotypes, very often because they struggle with specific activities and specific skills. This is overgeneralized to assume that they are simply incompetent across all areas of life and need other people to make decisions for them, run their lives for them, and take away their choices. They are given limited access to opportunities others take for granted right the way from their childhood through adult life. Usually have limited access to positive and aspirational role models. There are very few positive and aspirational role models around for people who learn disabilities. That is changing slowly in relation to people with Down syndrome, given that we see more representations of them in the media. And altogether, this is a context in which low self-esteem, mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, but also abuse and hate crimes can flourish. And finally, stigma has been identified as a key contributor to health and social inequalities. And a very eminent colleague of mine at UCL, Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who is a leading global figure on health and social inequalities, had this to say in a recent report. He said, people with learning disabilities are more likely than the general population to experience some of the worst of what society has to offer, including low incomes, unemployment, poor housing, social isolation, and loneliness, bullying, and abuse. Now, most of this is not directly related to some of the difficulties and limitations that come with having a learning disability or indeed Down syndrome, but they're very much due to the social conditions we impose on the lives of people with learning disabilities. Institutional stigma has been defined as the embodying of stereotypes in laws in institutions. And I would argue that by in some way describing children with Down syndrome as burdensome and less worthy, and Eloise articulated this morning how, in a way, by focusing on the one hand, putting mothers' interests at the forefront, but on the other hand, picking out a few conditions, and Down syndrome as one of them, as a particular case on which to focus and which to describe as burdensome. I think there is a case here of embodying a negative stereotype of children with Down syndrome in this legal provision. So what is the impact on that? First of all, in society generally, and in particular parts of society, we've already heard a lot how this perpetuates negative stigmatizing attitudes, for example, among healthcare providers. Yes, very often they may be lacking the particular training, they may have had very few opportunities to learn very specifically about Down syndrome, what it means. They may be concerned about possible legal liability, but also there's certainly, we've heard a lot, Moy's experience, and certainly many things I've heard from women in my own circle, lots of biased information giving and advice, which at the heart of which are these stigmatizing ideas that this is very negative and burdensome. It can lead, for people who learn disabilities themselves, this can very often lead to self-stigma and an idea that I am less worthy, I'm just not as important or valuable as other people in society. And I think some of the arguments around Section 11D and why we should be seeking change, this was drawn up many years ago at a time when the lives of people when life expectancy for people with Down syndrome was much lower, when people were very often raised in institutions and society was much less accepting. Now the field has changed hugely, and I think we're currently finding ourselves in a time in history when, on the one hand, there are very much more accepting attitudes characterize society. On the other hand, we still very much see a fertile ground for dehumanizing attitudes and actions. So on the screen there on the left-hand side, you see George Webster, who in September 2021, so only 5 months ago, was made the first presenter with Down syndrome of CBeebies, the popular children's show. And he is one of the numerous people who are contributing to more and more representation of people with disabilities, including people with Down syndrome in the media, which I think very much characterizes a much greater interest and willingness to see people who traditionally have been seen as different and undesirable in the broad stream of the media. On the other hand, all too often people with learning disabilities continue to experience bullying, neglect and abuse within our education, social care and health systems. And on the right hand there, this is reporting after yet another undercover BBC Panorama programme. This one was shown in May 2019 of Walton Hall. Now, very often when we talk about disability hate crimes, there is an immediate anger and disgust expressed as the individual perpetrators who are blamed. In this case and in many others, this is very much about healthcare systems and care systems that allow horrendous acts against people with learning disabilities and autism to occur yet and yet again. So I think it's too simple to think that we are simply seeing individual acts, but rather I think these things continuing to happen in our care systems reflects a much wider dehumanization of people with learning disabilities in society, and is made possible by a society that on the one hand expresses accepting attitudes, but on the other hand shows little regard to the needs and interests of the approximately 2% of the population who have a learning disability. And most recently we've seen this in a very disproportionate negative impact of the pandemic on the lives of people with learning disabilities. We've not only seen savage cuts to services, but even after the Department of Health published data to say that people with learning disabilities were at much greater risk of dying from COVID, people with learning disabilities and their families had to wage battle with the government to get prioritized for COVID vaccines at the time when there was the most intense concerns over the risk to life posed by COVID. Now, around the same time, along came two courageous women taking the government to the High Court. And why did I decide, as an expert on stigma, but also very much a woman who positions herself as pro-choice and a feminist clinical academic, to support this case? Now, first of all, in research, so the diagram you see there is from one of our studies of looking at many countries globally. What are societal attitudes and what are the representations of people with learning disabilities in the media? You see there very much a sort of kaleidoscope of different attitudes. In the UK, I think it's fair to say that most of what we're seeing is in the top left-hand quarter of the quadrant. So on the whole, people, members of the general population, agree in the principle of inclusion. We have long, for 30 years now in this country, we've closed all the large institutions. There is legislation in place to protect the interests of people with learning disabilities. And there's a lot of evidence about the benefits of inclusion, not just for people with learning disabilities, but also for their peers without disabilities. Having said that, there are still at times, there's still an attitude around of not in my backyard, and there are huge barriers to inclusion in place. But whichever way we see it, there certainly has been a historical shift in attitudes, and society now is much more accepting and welcoming of people with learning disabilities. So having this legal provision in place certainly seems rather outdated. My position is also informed by what we know from research about the impact of demeaning messages on the well-being and life chances of people with learning disabilities. So messages such as that they are less worthy and not equal human beings. In particular, two systematic reviews, or one a rapid review, first of all by Beard et al. And then my own group at UCL in 2018. And in our review, we looked at 16 studies, 11 of which were conducted in the United Kingdom, with overall a pretty respectable sample for learning disability research. And the key conclusions we drew is that most people with learning disabilities appear very aware of their diagnosis or this label they've been given of a learning disability, and they know that they're in some way seen as different. They also, the vast majority also recognize that society and people without disabilities view this label of a learning disability negatively, and many experience, not surprisingly, discomfort, feelings such as shame, embarrassment, and dejection when talking about somehow being othered and being seen as different by society. Now, I've already talked briefly about the impact of stigma on people with Down syndrome and people with learning disabilities due to other causes, but multiple studies have shown that stigma can be harmful to people with learning disabilities. On the left-hand side there, you see the cover of a textbook on intellectual disability and stigma that I had the pleasure to co-edit with my colleague Shirley Werner. And this tracks in a lot of detail the impact of stigma on the lives. But just some of the key messages is that stigma very much is a driver of acts of hostility, abuse, and othering, that people with learning disabilities have been excluded for a long time from community life, have had their opportunities, equal opportunities that all of us would take for granted, and their equal rights denied, and are still often avoided in social situations on the basis of ideas that they are somehow undesirable or burdensome. And finally, as I said before, they experience an increased risk of psychological distress and decreased self-esteem and a poorer quality of life. So overall, stigma and the negative messaging, such as that inherent within Section 11D, I would argue can be harmful to people with intellectual disabilities. And now lastly, there is the first-hand evidence, hearing from people with Down syndrome themselves. On the left-hand side, many of you will be aware of a storyline in Emmerdale a while ago. I think it was about 18 months ago now, when there was a storyline of parents expecting a child with Down syndrome and shown in very, very great distress over trying to decide whether to abort this child or not. At the time, people with learning disabilities and their families came out in very, very vocally to say how very distressing this storyline was. And it was very interesting while ITV defended themselves in coming up with this storyline, considered it very carefully. They'd taken advice from charities and organizations looking after the interests of pregnant mothers, but they hadn't really engaged with people with learning disabilities and people with Down syndrome and their families in particular. And on the right-hand side is a feature from the Sunday Times. I'm not going to play this now, but many of you may have seen this. This was on the 4th of July of last year, a few days before Heidi's case was heard in the High Court. And in a brief film that was made as part of this story, Heidi talks about, and her mother talks about, how aged 16 she became aware of this provision in the Abortion Act, and very, very much experienced this in very discriminatory and negative terms, as saying that her life was simply terrible, burdensome, and not really worth living. So overall, then, I would say that this legislative provision of Section 11D is firmly situated within a context of institutional stigma that not only reflects, but rather perpetuates a stigmatizing discourse of people with learning disabilities and people with Down syndrome in particular as somehow lesser than. What about women's right to choose? Now, obviously, it's really, really important to recognize that not all parents have the financial, practical, and emotional resources to raise a child with a disability. And often it is very, very stressful to find a nursery or a school able to meet the needs of a child with special education needs. And many parents, usually mothers, have to give up work. But a key part of the solution, I would argue, has to be to improve services and provision for disabled children and their families, and to improve support for parents and siblings. I think the solution cannot be to present information to pregnant women in a manner that is often heavily biased and very much focuses on the impact of societal barriers rather than what we could actually achieve if we were engaged in offering much more proactive support and looking more proactively for solutions that support people with Down syndrome and their families. In closing then, I want to just briefly touch on one of the most influential thinkers in the field of learning disabilities, Wolfensberger. As I said before, I think there's no question that an idea is enshrined in section 11D that having a child with Down syndrome is above all a heavy burden for those unfortunate enough to be the parents of someone with Down syndrome, and that the lives of people with disabilities are so terrible that they are not worth living. Now, Wolfensberger talked about sanctioned death making, and he wrote about, against a background of growing up in Germany and witnessing the Nazi atrocities. Obviously, I don't want to go so far, and I'd be cautious about talking about eugenics here, but certainly what Wolfensberger talked about was the inescapable logic of devaluing human beings, the consequences of codified dehumanization of those a society labels, perceives, and markets as less than human. And I would certainly say I'm a healthcare professional by training myself, but there's still very deeply held beliefs within society which also certainly affect the thinking and the communications and actions of healthcare providers, which somehow start with people with Down syndrome and other forms of disabilities as somewhat less worthy and less human. And I would say finally, as a society, at the present time, I see us as torn between two conflicting opposites. On the one side, we've got a much greater acceptance of people who don't fit the norm across all spheres of society, and admiration for the likes of Heidi Crowter and George Webster, the CBeebies presenter. But on the opposite side, we tolerate legal provision, and we tolerate many other practices in our education systems and care systems that uphold outdated beliefs that these are somehow lives that are less worth living, and that also turn a blind eye to social conditions that make the lives of people with disabilities and their families that very much harder. On closing, I just want to get back to Eloise's question this morning. What do we need to do if we want to have a society that welcomes children and adults with disabilities? I don't have any easy answers to that at all, but I think that is the fundamental question, and also a question by an audience member this morning. How can we manage the paradox of supporting women's right to choose, but also promote societal values and practices that accept and include people with learning disabilities? And I'm not convinced that the answers are within the legal sphere, but they're certainly within the grasp of society and our parliament. Thank you very much.